Hi everyone, this is the next video of the poem The Gun. So The Gun is a poem I really like actually, and I was quite looking forward to having lots of discussion and debate with you about this poem, but given the situation we're in, we'll just have to make use of the video for now, but hopefully you'll find it interesting and enjoy it as well. In a way, this is quite a simple, straightforward poem, and as the title suggests, The Gun, it is about a gun. A gun being brought into the house. It considers what guns are used for. But as I said, it can be quite simple and quite straightforward, but I still think quite interesting perhaps in some of the ideas that it raises. So the opening of the poem is this line and a half on its own. And always with poems, when you have lines on their own, they draw our attention, they stand out on the page. And so the poet is quite deliberately here trying to raise our interest in this gun. And it's quite an ambiguous and intriguing opening. Bringing a gun into a house changes it. So we're told from the outset of this poem that a gun changes the house, changes the home. We're not told how, we're not necessarily told why. So it starts to perhaps create questions in the reader's minds. In what way does the gun change the house? Okay, so quite an intriguing opening. And we've got the end stop there, which creates quite a strong caesura, and the fact that this is just a line and a half on its own means that the reader has time to pause and to ponder that and to think, how might a gun change a house? Perhaps it's a threatening or unnerving opening to the poem. You know, this is a poem about a gun, and with that, the title has certain connotations. Guns have certain connotations with death, with destruction, with pain, with suffering. So perhaps initially when we read the poem, we're a little bit unnerved by it and a bit cautious, perhaps a bit apprehensive about what may follow in this poem. Then we move into the second stanza. You lay it on the kitchen table, stretched out like something dead itself. So straight away, we've got the pronoun you. We've got that direct mode of address, and it can be interpreted like it can in lots of poems in two different ways. Is the you another character in this poem? Is the you in this poem the person who owns the gun, and therefore is the speaker, the narrator, the partner of the person who has the gun? That's one way of looking at that you. But obviously, when we have a poem and it uses you, direct mode of address, if we're reading it, that's referring to us, the reader, as we say it. You lay it on the kitchen table. So we become involved in this poem, and we are forced with the inclusion of you to consider what it would be like if we were gun owners, if we were the person bringing this into the house. And perhaps it forces us even to feel a sense of maybe guilt, or as if we are complicit in this act, because it's got that you. So quite deliberate from the poet to try and make the reader feel instantly involved in this poem. And where the gun is laid is important. You lay it on the kitchen table. So the kitchen, the domestic sphere. So this gun, this tool of destruction, is being brought into kind of the center of the household, the place where we prepare meals to fill our family, the space that's occupied by families and loved ones, now has a gun in it. So we've got this tension perhaps between this life of destruction and this life of domesticity. Stretched out like something dead itself. We've got the enjambment from the line dead to itself, drawing our attention again to those words dead. So one of the themes of the poems, things being killed, being executed, is brought to us here and emphasized to us here with that enjambment, because it's dead and then itself on the next line. For me, because the fact that the line goes from one to the next in that kind of dropping fashion, it's symbolic, I suppose, of somebody being killed and dropping to the ground, or something being killed and dropping to the ground. Obviously, it's like a simile. Arguably here, the fact that it's stretched out, it almost seems to kind of personifying the gun, almost giving it human qualities, as if it's got some sort of active agent in this poem, possibly. Then we've got the colon, and following the colon is a description of the gun. And the gun, from that description, I imagine it probably looks something like this. It talks about the polished wood stock. So this bit here, made of wood, Obviously, the wood is polished, so it perhaps suggests that this gun has some importance in this household. It's been polished, it's been taken care of, it's been looked after. It means something here. Jutting over the edge. So when it's on the table, that bit is jutting over the edge. The word jutting, perhaps that T sound is quite harsh, and so maybe that is, again, deliberate to kind of mirror that this poem may involve ideas that are harsh, brutality, destruction, jutting over the edge. And that phrase, over the edge, things that are on the edge, on the boundary, are often things that challenge us. And so perhaps there's some mirroring in the language there with the ideas in this poem, that guns, for some people, are uncomfortable and they tip people over the edge, that kind of expression. The long metal barrel, casting a grey shadow. And for me, I noticed that these lines, they're shorter than the others in the poem, so it draws our attention, further attention, to the image of the gun. So this gun is being given real status and real importance in this poem. Perhaps the attention to detail of the description of the guns, the polished, the long metal barrel, again, signifies its importance. It's been given this attention. There are some people who with poems often take a kind of a sexual reading of the poem, and you could perhaps argue that with that focus on the long metal barrel, there's almost a phallic image, possibly. Or alternatively, is it kind of trying to signify masculinity, and stereotypically perhaps we associate guns and hunting with men more than with women. But we've also got perhaps this metaphoric idea as well, that even though this gun is in the kitchen, it's important, it's polished, it's casting a grey shadow. So obviously in the literal, it could be casting a shadow on the table where it's being placed because of the angle of the light of the sun. But obviously, symbolically, the grey shadow could be a sign that this object brings darkness, and that there's a slightly uncomfortable conversation to be had about the gun in the home, possibly. And that shadow and that gun as well is on the green checked cloth. So at the end of the stanza, the poet goes back to the idea of this contrasting imagery, contrasting the ideas of the home and the domestic sphere with the gun, with this tool of execution. Okay, then moving on to the next stanza. So we had the end stop previously, to sort of tell us that is the end of the stanzas which focus on describing the gun. And now the poet is going to begin to exploring the journey of first using the gun. So at first, that discourse marker to help us, at first it's just practice. So the speaker of the poem tells us that at first, this gun was just used to practice hitting objects. And we get at the start of the poem perhaps a kind of innocent and almost childlike portrayal of what the gun is used for. Perforating tins. For me, it's interesting that the poet has chosen the word perforating rather than something like piercing. Perforating, again, it suggests that this is something innocent. It's not causing harm. It's just putting a few holes in some tins. It's not killing an animal. It's not wounding an animal, putting a hole through an animal yet. Perforating tins dangling on orange string from trees in the garden. So that innocent image of this just being used almost as a toy, perhaps a shooting practice. And we might picture perhaps a teenager shooting the gun at these tins, scoring points, and it's fairly harmless here. We've got maybe a semantic field of nature with the description of the trees and the garden, which you could argue is trying to convey that this is a natural thing to do. To use a gun is a natural thing to do. And for many people, and perhaps people in countries like America where they have guns in their home, this is a normal rite of passage. And so here we've got this idea of this being natural, being normal. You've got the colour imagery, orange, which gives this whole idea, a kind of vibrancy, that this is something to enjoy. This person using the gun is getting enjoyment and fulfillment, and this is a vibrant moment in their life, perhaps. It might be orange deliberately as well, because an orange, not just a colour, but the fruit, which adds to that kind of perhaps semantic field of nature that we have in this stanza. But as is so important with lots of the poems that we looked at, this end stop, this full stop at the end of the line to show a kind of clear ending of that idea, and then that is immediately contrasted with then a rabbit shot clean through the head. So we get the innocence of the first 4 lines of the stanza contrasted with the last 2 lines of the stanza, where there's been this shift, this change. The speaker is reflecting on how this gun that was first used as just shooting practice has now actually killed, clean through the head. No romanticizing or glorification of that image, just blunt, direct, detached. This is what happens. And in some ways you might then think in this poem that it's a kind of a non-judgmental poem about using guns. It is just reflecting what happens, and it's up to you, the reader, to decide whether you think you can use this poem to criticize people using guns, or whether it is just a way of life, whether it's important, whether it's essential. And obviously different readers have different interpretations of that, particularly perhaps if you chose to be a vegetarian because you don't believe in the killing of animals. That may be very different to someone who perhaps lives on a farm, works on a farm, raises animals to be slaughtered for their livelihood. So different readers have lots of different interpretations of this poem, as you can imagine. And then in terms of the structure of this poem, it continues with this kind of building idea, this intensifying idea. Starts off with that innocent, childlike idea of just shooting practice. Then it kind of steps up with the killing of a rabbit. It's one rabbit, it's in isolation in the previous stanza. But now in this stanza, we've got the idea that soon the fridge fills with creatures. So we're not talking about one rabbit being killed now, we're talking about a fridge which is filled. Lots and lots of shooting has happened, lots of killing has happened. The fricative, so that's the repetition of the F sound, when we're talking about different forms of alliteration, draws our attention to that image, this full fridge. And again, can perhaps be quite unsettling or quite unnerving, maybe even shocking to some, that idea. Perhaps it seems quite ruthless, maybe inhumane, or for others just entirely natural and normal. And if we eat meat, then obviously there's an animal that's killed to produce that. So soon the fridge fills with creatures that have run and flown. The past tense, have run and flown. It's very, very clear that these animals now, their freedom has been ended. The writer has deliberately chosen run and flown, those verbs, to kind of suggest perhaps how free and how full of life these animals were before they were killed. So again, some readers may take this as a criticism of killing animals for food. Or is it the alternative? It's stressing that these animals had a good life, they had a rich life, they run and they flew, and now they've been killed and they will serve another purpose to human beings eating that flesh. Again, we've got another end stop, so the kind of end of that idea. We've just been told that the fridge is full of these animals that had run, have flown, end of that idea, and now something's slightly different. The your comes in again, that pronoun, that you. Is it talking to the gun owner? Is it talking to us? It is talking to the gun owner in this poem, but because of the use of the your, it makes us feel perhaps, or put ourselves in the position of that gun owner. What would it be like if it was me? Your hands reek of gun oil. Again, end stop. So short, direct line in the poem here. Your hands reek of gun oil. So matter of factual, perhaps, not judgmental, maybe, but that word reek does have connotations with a smell which is unpleasant and lasting and welcome. And if it's not the gun owner in the poem, if it's us, if we are meat eaters, perhaps it does make us remember where our meat comes from and make us feel complicit in the act of this murder. So the idea of kind of, you've got blood on your hands, you've got you reek of gun oil. You are responsible for this. You are part of this process. Even if you are not the person doing the executing yourself, you're still eating the product, so you're still, culpable in that way, perhaps. And then that sort of a darker idea is further with the entrails. So you reek of gun oil and entrails, so the insides of the animals. So, unpleasant, uncomfortable images for some. For others, perhaps, as I said, just completely normal. It's matter-factual. That's what happens. You kill the animal, you get the animal, you eat the animal. Again, the end stops are these kind of blunt, direct. Sorry, not the end stop, the full stop in the line. Blunt, direct. You, so more this directing. You trample fur and feathers. So the trample, that verb, gives us connotations of kind of destroying. And what we're destroying is fur and feathers. So interestingly, we've got more fricative language. So we've got the F sounds in this poem. So perhaps we looking on the page, join the dots between the full fridge and the fur and feathers. And it's to remind us that fridge that is full of animals is full of animals that once were creatures that had soft fur and feathers. The softness of that imagery, fur and feathers, contrasts against the harsh, metal of the gun. And we perhaps get an image then of kind of the innocence versus the darkness, the brutality, the destruction. And then this full stop is important in dividing that fur and feathers with there's a spring in your step. Your eyes gleam like when sex was fresh. So we're drawing attention to the idea, though, that this killing now, it's not just practice. It is actually making the person with the gun feel alive. There's a spring in your step. There's a sense of enjoyment or pleasure that they've had from killing these animals. So the poet perhaps, again, leaves us to consider what we think about that, what we feel about that. And in many ways, the poet here is dealing with a taboo subject, a taboo idea, that there will be people who don't feel comfortable with that idea, that people get enjoyment from killing and from hunting. Your eyes gleam like when sex was fresh. So we've got the simile here, and the idea of new sex and young sex and being kind of full of life and full of vitality being used here. But again, lots of people would think that sex is natural. So is it going back to the idea that this killing, this hunting, is a natural idea that's happened for millions of years? Okay, and then we get another single line stanza, which kind of takes us back to the line and a half that was at the start of the poem. A gun brings a house alive. At the start of the poem, we were told that a gun changes a house. We weren't told how or why. It's almost like the poet is returning to that opening and answering that question, putting forward the answer now. A gun brings a house to life. And again, it's quite an unsettling, perhaps, statement, that kind of taboo subject, that a gun makes people feel alive, makes them feel joy, makes them feel powerful. That's one interpretation. Arguably, as the next stanza will go on, it's talking about what happens with the animals that are being killed, that are cooked, that are eaten. So is it just that a gun brings a house alive because it brings in food for the family, and it brings in something actually that unites a family in cooking together? And so now in the final stanza, we have the first inclusion of the first person I. So we've got the true voice of the narrator of the poem, the partner of the person who has a gun. I join in the cooking. And here it almost seems to be like a confession. This is their part to play. They join in the cooking. They don't join in with the killing, but they do join in with the cooking. And so they're kind of accepting their role in this murder of these animals, perhaps food. Again, the colons are describing what they do further. Jointing and slicing, stirring and tasting. So we've got a list of verbs all ending in, creating a kind of rhythm there, which perhaps suggests a kind of sense of joy and pace and excitement and energy that this kill has brought to the house. So going back to the previous one line, a gun brings a house alive. And then, if we weren't sure though, it tells very clearly, excited, actually. This brings excitement to the narrator as well as the partner who's done the killing. Excited as if the king of death had arrived to feast. It's interesting perhaps that it's the king of death. So the king, you know, some figure that we would respect, look up to, admire. So actually, again, this idea that this killing is not something which is looked down upon in this particular household, but that is welcomed, that is celebrated, that is embraced. And again, for some readers, that might be an uncomfortable idea. For others, completely normal, completely natural, and something to be celebrated, hunting and killing, and sourcing your own food, possibly. So perhaps the idea of the feast, you know, a feast it would suggest that there's lots of food and that people take their time over it, usually a time for celebration as well. So that adding here's the idea of the kill being for enjoyment, but for others that might feel uncomfortable. It continues with this idea of the simile of the king of death, this king of death who has been stalking out of winter's woods, his black mouth sprouting golden crocuses. So the king of death at first is kind of stalking. You know, to stalk is to kind of be moving secretly and hidden. And that perhaps goes back to the idea that I said earlier about this being a taboo subject. There are some people who think that, you know, we shouldn't hunt and we shouldn't kill. And we certainly shouldn't get enjoyment or pleasure from it, perhaps. And so that king of death has been stalking in the winter woods, hidden away, with black mouth, so you know the connotations of the word black. This is a figure of evil, of darkness, and yet the last line of the poem, sprouting golden crocuses. So out of the darkness, out of the death, grows something golden. Arguably, the fact that the last colour used in this poem is golden would maybe signify that this is a poem that isn't judging hunting and killing, but is actually celebrating it. But as always, that's just my interpretation of the poem. There'll be plenty of others out there. You can read the notes on the portal. Also look at the poem yourself. Come to your own views about the poem. And I look forward to hearing them very, very soon. Take care.